Hi everyone, in today's module we'll be talking about essential elements and how they impact the way plants grow, and then we'll talk about one of the most important essential elements, nitrogen, and why it is so important for plant function. Here is a long list of essential elements required by most plants. It gives a nice distinction of where some of them come from. For example, hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, of course, that is going to come from a lot of water and carbon dioxide that gets absorbed by the plant. So you can see in this column with concentration in dry matter that these values are really high. We also have essential elements that are obtained from the soil as macronutrients, and this goes from everything from nitrogen, potassium, all the way down to sulfur and silicon. And again, this macronutrients group just simply means that they are obtained and found in really high amounts within each plant. And then if we go down to the micronutrients, yes, these are essential elements as well, important for function, but they are not found in as high of abundance as the other macronutrients. One interesting one I always find it difficult to say is molybdenum. That is a really interesting element. As you can see, looking at this particular table, if you look over here, and you see that there's this interesting metric used in this column, relative number of atoms with respect to molybdenum. So what that means is essentially we don't need much of it. It is found in such low amounts relative to all these other essential elements. And so essentially for every single atom of molybdenum that we find in a plant, that is one atom of that relative to 60 million of hydrogen. So that's just how low in abundance we find it inside plants. But it is absolutely important for function. If plants do not have molybdenum present, they simply won't do well, or they die without it. So it has an interesting role. It can be a cofactor and help with diffusion of certain ions. It's super important, but it's oddly found in such low values. So with this big list of essential elements, where exactly are they going? Well, if we just think about this really quickly, we can generate a list. A few things come to mind right away for me. One would be proteins. Of course, enzymes. We've talked a lot about enzymes. Other things, pigments. We've talked a bunch about pigments already and how important they are for absorbing things like light. Other things as well important for not just plants, other organisms, lipids. Of course, nucleic acids. And amino acids. So this is just a really quick list that we can make to determine where are these essential elements going. So that's where they are going, but what about their functional role? So if I just stop and think about this for a second, then I think about, well, immediately we've talked a bunch about structure. So we've talked about lipids and proteins being part of membranes. We've talked about cell walls. We've talked about all these different aspects to plant function as it relates to structure. And we've spent a lot of time now thinking about carbon capture or the fixation of CO2 during photosynthesis. And I group that in the category of metabolism. And of course, other things are super important to plant function, and this could be things related to diffusion or anything related to moving things across membranes, such as ions. So putting this all together, if you have a lack or a deficiency in any of these essential elements, this means you're going to have a major lack in structure or function in the future, and that could be really detrimental for plant growth and survival. So let's think about the impacts on growth. How plants grow and where they allocate their growth is highly dependent on the availability of water and nutrients, especially in this region called the rhizosphere, which is the microenvironment surrounding the root. And plants are so good at kind of searching for and absorbing nutrients wherever they are in the soil. And they also have different physiological strategies that we'll get into a little bit more in the next module. But for right now, in thinking about grabbing all of those nutrients and how essential they are for growth, well, plants have really different strategies in how they grow. And when I talk about how plants grow, what I'm really referring to is the allocation of biomass in plants, meaning how much biomass is a plant allocating to the roots versus how much plants are allocating to the shoots. And how plants are going to allocate their growth is in direct response to the nutrient availability in the soil. So let's think about two different nutrient scenarios. On this graph here, we have low nutrients, so just it's a limiting factor. There aren't many nutrients to go around. And on the right, we have high nutrient availability. So in this case, let's draw a bar graph that illustrates how biomass gets allocated under these two different scenarios. So this y-axis here has a root-to-shoot ratio. What that basically means is you're looking at the amount of biomass in the roots relative to the biomass in the shoots. And this may seem like kind of an odd variable or ratio to think about, but it is one of the most commonly used plant traits by plant physiologists because there's so much information that you can get from this. So let's take a moment to pause here and draw a single bar graph under the low nutrients scenario, as well as a single bar graph in the high nutrient scenario. So again, root to shoot biomass, root biomass divided by shoot biomass. That is basically our ratio that we're thinking about here. So press pause and think about it. Now that you've thought about it, let's go over these graphs together. So starting with the low nutrients on the left side of the graph here, while I would expect a bar graph to look something like this. And if we compare it to a high nutrient situation, something like that. So what accounts for these differences? What this basically means is that in an environment where nutrients are not as available, plants tend to allocate more biomass to roots, and therefore the root to shoot ratio will be higher, definitely higher than what we would see under a high nutrient scenario. So these are kind of the basic comparisons you can make, a really super important plant trait that many plant physiologists use. And this is a good way to think about how plants are kind of strategizing under different environmental scenarios. But of course, there is always a trade-off. And the trade-off will be carbon capture. So if plants tend to have high root to shoot ratios, therefore allocating a lot more biomass to the roots, well, that means we don't have a lot of biomass or leaf area in the shoots, and therefore we are reducing the plant's ability to absorb light as well as capture carbon or CO2 during photosynthesis. So that is the ultimate trade-off. In search of nutrients in the soil, allocating root growth in that direction while we limit our shoot growth. And so it becomes this balancing issue that we have to deal with. And in general, we can get a lot of variation in root morphology. If we just look at this newly germinated plant here on the left, you can see all these neat little root hairs here. And of course, getting back to our diagrams of what's happening, we have the meristematic region of elongation, and then we get to this area here, this zone of maturation. And this is where we're going to see a lot of these root hair extensions on the epidermal cells, and this is what helps absorb all of these nutrients. And we can see great variation in this. So this graph on the right here, we could see a plant that has this kind of root morphology, but we could also see a plant in a similar in a similar environment where it has the bulk of its root material and biomass very close to the soil surface. So even within a species, we can get high variability in what's happening below ground. The problem is we really don't know unless we start digging up the roots, and of course that's a real problem for a disturbance. So we can make some general assumptions about plant traits and how their roots look and how they're growing, but the best way to find out is to dig them up. So getting back to our list of essential elements, the top three, hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, they're present in such high amounts. Of course, these are coming from water or CO2, but what about the others? And we don't have time to talk about every single essential element, so I want to focus on what I view and many plant physiologists view as the most important macronutrient, is the one that is talked about the most, and that is nitrogen right here. So why is nitrogen so important? Perhaps the best way to answer this is to think about the relationship between various plant traits. Here on the bottom left graph, we have a blank graph with leaf age on the x-axis and leaf nitrogen content on the y-axis. And on the right graph, we have leaf nitrogen content switching to the x-axis, as well as photosynthetic rate on the y-axis. So why are these graphs here? Well, this is to help think about the important relationships between different plant traits. And this will help explain why leaf nitrogen is so important. So go ahead and draw a line graph for each one of these that shows the relationship between these two plant traits. How is leaf age here going to impact leaf nitrogen content, as well as on the right, how does leaf nitrogen content here influence photosynthetic rate? So take a moment to press pause and draw these out. Now that you've thought about it and drew some graphs, let's go over them together. So in the case of the bottom left, with leaf age influencing leaf nitrogen content, this is the typical graph that you will see, something that looks like this. So what does this mean? This means that with really young leaves, those that have just been grown, those are going to tend to have really high nitrogen content. And so this is really important for, growth or really fast plant growth in some of these early stages, even if it's just germinated or if it's putting on new leaf material, it's going to have really high leaf nitrogen content. And what about on the right, leaf nitrogen content, and how does that influence photosynthetic rate? Well, I would draw a graph that looked a lot like this. So this is a general trend that we see out there in the world for many different types of plants. The higher leaf nitrogen content there is, the higher the photosynthetic rate. And yes, we can see some variation in this, but these would be general patterns that a lot of scientists would predict would happen for many different types of plants. And thinking a little bit more about why nitrogen is so important, or what is the basis for its importance, well, we spent a lot of time talking about photosynthesis. Obviously, without it, plants don't grow or produce sugars and biomass, but they need essential elements to assist them in this process. And during this process, we also talked quite a bit about important enzymes like rubisco. So a key player in photosynthesis, in C3 plants, rubisco can account for nearly half of the total leaf nitrogen content. That is a really high amount. And when we compare that to C4 plants, it's much less. And the reason is because, as we've talked about, there's a different enzyme involved. We don't have as much rubisco in C4 plants because of this, and therefore their nitrogen use will be a little bit lower. In a sense, you can think of it as that C4 plants tend to be much more efficient in their nitrogen use relative to C3 plants. And I have all these graphs in the background here, and so let's talk about that. These are some typical graphs for making hypotheses or drawing conclusions even about how different plant traits are related to each other, just like we did in the previous slide. And all of this, as you can see, there are lots of data points in all of these graphs. So this is a really large data set from scientists across the world adding their information to this data set. It's publicly available. And this is what we tend to see across many different plant types in many different regions of the world. Of course, it's not totally set in stone. You can see there's definitely some variation here, but for the most part, this is what we would expect to see. Something like this: the higher the leaf nitrogen, the higher the photosynthetic rate. On the left here, instead of age, it has leaf lifespan, but these are fairly similar in concept, or I can wrap my head around that, and that they will have a similar trend with, a younger leaf or a shorter leaf lifespan will have higher nitrogen content. And then you can make the leap too to think about leaf age or leaf lifespan and how that affects photosynthetic rate. Younger leaves are going to tend to have this higher nitrogen content and therefore higher photosynthetic rate. And so this is something that we were doing in the plant physiology lab, where in theory we would be grinding leaf tissue samples right now, homogenizing them, and sending those samples to Cornell so they can analyze them for us, and we would get this leaf nitrogen content. And at the same time, throughout the semester, we have measured leaf gas exchange, so that would give us stomatoconductance, something we've talked a lot about this semester, in photosynthetic rate. And then we can make a graph like this that tells us how important nitrogen is for the various plants that we're working with. So again, these are general trends. Now, sometimes we do find amazing exceptions to the rule. That's, to me, part of the fun of getting all of this data. Like, what is this relationship going to look like? So that's the part of the fun of it. But in general, this is what we should see across many different plant types. That's it for today's module. Your main takeaway should be how essential elements are important for plant function, how low versus high nutrient availability affects the way plants grow, and how nitrogen can be so important for overall plant function.